Slayers are one of the most iconic elements of the Warhammer Fantasy universe, and one of the most unique units in the Dwarf roster. But they can be a little bit odd to use because of how they behave as units. Slayers have solid melee stats, they have the Unbreakable ability, which means they'll never rout under any circumstance, and they have a pretty great anti-large bonus. But they have pretty low entity count per unit. It's only 60 Slayers to a unit of Slayers, whereas Dwarf Warriors get about 75 Dwarfs to a unit. So the Slayers get overwhelmed pretty easily. On top of that, they're pretty expensive at, I believe, twice the cost of a regular unit of Dwarf Warriors. And even though they have a bonus versus large, they do not get charge defense versus large, which means they take a lot of damage if the monsters and cavalry who are their usual targets charge them directly in the face. Unlike your usual unit of, let's say, Empire Spearmen or Halberdiers, who would be immune to that. So for new and new-ish players to Total War Warhammer, I thought I might put together a little video of formations to use while playing the Dwarfs to get some use out of the Slayers in your campaign, though I cannot guarantee effectiveness for multiplayer or for those who are looking for a little bit of a cheesier experience. Now for these first couple of very basic formations, I've gone with a very basic Dwarf army: Warriors, Quarrelers, Slayers, and a Lord. Well, on the opposite side, a basic Empire army featuring just some swordsmen, archers, and some basic knights, as well as your basic Empire general. The simplest thing to do with your Dwarf Slayers is to keep them behind a front line of Dwarf Warriors. While Dwarf Warriors don't have a bonus versus large, they do have charge defense versus large, which means that they can take the frontal charges of monsters and cavalry and not take that much damage, especially compared to the Slayers themselves. In this position, the Slayers can protect your vulnerable missile units and artillery from flankers while they go ahead and cover the front line. In addition, while usually cavalry makes sense as a flanking unit, with the heavier cavalry units, and sometimes even the lighter cavalry units, the AI is typically dumb enough to go ahead and charge them right into the front of your Dwarf Warriors, and that is when you tell your Slayers to move in and get some action. With any luck, the enemy's cavalry will be trapped in the bog of infantry and will get shredded. For an alternative but very similar formation, you can leave the Slayers on your flanks. While this leaves the Dwarf Warriors to do more of the work by themselves, the Slayers, when the lines meet, will be able to flank into the enemy's rear, taking out missiles, hitting infantry in the rear, and so on. By the way, this is just kind of an odd thing about how Total War AI behaves, but you are going to want Slayers, like a lot of units that you want to keep maneuverable, you'll want to keep it in a relatively square formation. This is about as close as I could get, just on quick notice. Because if they're in a square formation, then they're going to spend less time trying to reform into their formation while moving, at least in my experience. Now, as the lines come closer to meeting, I bring my Dwarf Warriors into combat with our infantry. The AI confoundingly decides to bring the attack the flank on one side with Empire Swordsmen, but it's a free flank. We take those. While the other Slayer we will let go to town on their cavalry or their missiles. I'll choose the cavalry today. That sounds like a tastier little morsel. Didn't sound weird at all, did it? Now, one formation that every Total War campaign player should keep in their back pocket is the Checkerboard Formation. It can be used with really just about any kind of army, regardless of what kind of units you brought. As the name implies, the formation imitates the alternating square spaces of a checkerboard, with there being gaps between each of the units in your front line where a flanking unit can peer through. It's very effective with missile units, which is why I would have the Quarrelers right here. And it's still good for protecting those missile units and flanking units that you would put in that spot, because if the enemy were to try and charge through this gap between these Dwarf Warriors, the Warriors would flank them on the sides. But doing it just this way, with the missile units shooting down the middle of the split, while the Slayers are just left here protecting the flank, it's a little bit, it'll definitely be effective, but what if we were to get stupid here? Now that's better. It may not be more effective, but there's a lot of fun to being a mad scientist with this stuff, and who knows, you might find something that's actually pretty effective. And as expected, the Empire Swordsmen have left themselves open to being flanked by the Slayers. the Empire Knights curiously decide to attack my Dwarf Warriors from the side, almost head-on, but no accounting for AI bizarreness. It's not quite as effective as you might want, but hey, it might work a bit more if you get more units that can handle cavalry on the sides. And there we go, the AI finally behaves as it probably should have to begin with. What about a front line comprised of Slayers and nothing else? It's pretty effective against monster-heavy front lines like the Ogre Kingdoms, but even against lower-tiered infantry, Slayers can take quite a few casualties due to their low entity count and their lack of armor. Don't forget to support your Slayers with missiles. The kinds of large enemies that Slayers like to fight peer right over the Slayer's head, so they make easy targets for missiles to tear down. And generally in Total War Warhammer... Oh! That wasn't planned. But remember to use support with missiles. Now the Slayers arrive, just in time. Definitely saved the day. Still, I think that Slayer front lines can be very fun for thematic purposes, if pretty prohibitively expensive. But what if instead of getting rid of the Dwarf Warriors, we got rid of the Quarrelers, and had a Dwarf army that was nothing but a front line and Slayers, no missile support? With such a quantity of Slayers, I want to put them all on one flank, and just absolutely devastate that side of the enemy formation. While it leaves one side of my formation open to the enemy Empire Knights, it's a sacrifice I'm willing to make. While these particular Empire Knights on the other side of the flank are going to get devastated. As a matter of fact, I can go ahead and set off this one unit of Slayers to go take out their archers, just denying them missile support altogether. Dwarf Warriors are so tough that the exposed flank still really isn't doing that badly, honestly. Meanwhile, both the enemy Knights and the enemy missiles are not doing too well. Once you've cleared up the enemy's flankers and back line, you can go ahead and send the Slayers directly into the enemy's front line to flank them from both sides and do quite a bit of damage. This last one's really more of a tip for what to do with elite units, just any elite units in campaign, really, which Slayers very much land on the more elite side of the Dwarf roster. 900 recruitment cost and 225 upkeep, they better be elite. And what I'm talking about here is a just general tip of keeping units in reserve. While in multiplayer or custom battles, this doesn't matter so much, but in campaign, you gotta keep the long haul in mind. I've got a pretty solid force of dwarfs here, while the AI opponent that I've set up is running a pretty meager army. I'm not going to need the 3 Slayers I've got to beat that Empire army. I could remove the Slayers from my army entirely, and these dwarfs would still win. So, I'm just keeping them in the back of my army, where they can still function as a rear guard to defend against flankers, and they can also be put in place if any of these warriors rout, but I'm not really intending to actually use them. Something could go wrong. You know, it's Total War Warhammer. Weird stuff happens, especially if you're playing against the Skaven or, oh god, Ikit Claw. But the goal is to not use them, to not let them take damage. They probably would be more useful in a later battle. And on top of that, at such a high recruitment cost, and generally a building that's a bit higher tier, they're a little bit more difficult to replace than our standard Dwarf Warriors here. And you really want to be careful to make sure that they don't get hit by a Doom Rocket or anything that, let's say, Ikit, again, could be packing. So remember this for just about any elite unit for any army, but I do want to advise it specifically with Slayers, and especially with the Dwarfs. The Slayers can be more fragile than you think. And that's that. I hope with any of these tips or formations, I might have given any of you really more of an inclination to use the Slayers. I think they're a really fun, weird, more active and interesting unit, and a roster full of units that are really just encouraging for very solid, unshifting defensive play. I got a buddy of mine who once described Dwarf gameplay as make a formation, hit the start battle button, walk away, make a sandwich, come back to find that you've won. Slayers, like, by all means, if that is your ideal for Total War, more power to you. That certainly can be fun to do sometimes myself. But I also would like to see more aggressive options for the dwarves. More strange, kind of mixed up options for them. And Slayers, I think, are one of the dwarf units that signify where that can go. I'll admit that I don't even get as much use out of them as I really should. But they are just, well, I mean, look at them, right? Look at these little guys. Oh, little. I shouldn't have said that. I'm going in the book, I think. They're just, so good. Either which way. Oh, apparently I won. Apparently, even with Slayers, you don't have to actually tell them anything to do to win. Either which way. Hope I enjoyed the video. No, hope you enjoyed the video. My enjoyment is irrelevant. Hope you enjoyed the video. And I hope that someone was at least partly inspired to do their own stuff with the Slayers. And by all means, if you got ideas, I strongly encourage you to put them in the comments. I find it very interesting to be exposed to new sets of thought regarding Total War, especially with the Slayers, because I feel like I've only barely scratched the surface with these guys. There's something hidden to them, just a bit of hidden technique to them, and it's just waiting to be dug up. Either which way, see you folks later.